Function 3, through the relay of resistance. Function 3, epistemological emptying, the colonization of consciousness. The third function of the colorist architecture is the one that Malcolm X identified with the greatest precision and fought against with the greatest passion: the epistemological emptying of the colonized consciousness, the systematic removal of the historical knowledge, the cultural pride, and the sovereign self-perception that would allow the community to recognize the installed hierarchy for what it is and to refuse it. A community that knows its history, that understands the specific, documented, strategic process through which colorism was installed, that can trace the specific mechanisms through which the colonial system created and maintained the buffer class, that has access to the specific intellectual and cultural resources that allow it to see the manufactured condition as manufactured rather than natural, is a community that is significantly more resistant to the colorist architecture's operation. The epistemological emptying is therefore not incidental to the colorist project, it is essential to it. A people who do not know that the preference for lighter skin was installed by a colonial system cannot recognize it as an installation. A people who have been taught that their darkest-skinned members represent the least desirable version of themselves cannot recognize that teaching as a colonial technology. A people whose historical memory has been systematically suppressed cannot access the specific knowledge that would allow them to see the groove for what it is and refuse it. This is why the current legislative assault on Black history education, the banning of the 1619 Project from classrooms, the prohibition of critical race theory, the systematic removal from educational curricula of the specific historical knowledge that would allow students to understand the architecture of their own oppression is not merely an educational policy dispute. It is a direct attack on the epistemological foundation of resistance, the specific targeted removal of the cognitive tools that the community needs to see clearly, name accurately, and act effectively against the system that is harming it. The digital acceleration, how colorism has been algorithmicized. The cold strategic architecture of colorism has not merely survived into the digital age, it has been upgraded, digitized, algorithmicized, and automated in ways that make it simultaneously more pervasive, more precise, more profitable, and more difficult to see and challenge than at any previous point in its history. The specific mechanism of this upgrade is the encoding of historically racialized data into automated systems that reproduce the racial hierarchy with mathematical precision while providing the specific cover of technical neutrality. Track 1. The Beauty Industrial Complex and Algorithmic Aesthetic Enforcement. The beauty industry's digital infrastructure, the recommendation algorithms of beauty platforms, the filtering systems of social media, the image recognition systems that determine which faces are featured in digital advertising, has become one of the most powerful mechanisms of colorist aesthetic enforcement in the contemporary world. Beauty product recommendation algorithms trained on historical sales data that reflects decades of colorist consumer preferences will systematically recommend skin lightening products to darker-skinned users, not because the algorithm was programmed to enforce colorism, but because the historical data it learned from reflects a market that has been shaped by colorist preferences. The algorithm reproduces the preference. The preference generates more data. The data reinforces the algorithm. The loop is self-sealing. Social media image recognition systems that determine which faces are featured in algorithmically promoted content have been documented to systematically favor lighter-skinned faces, producing a digital public sphere in which the aesthetic standard of the colonizer is enforced not by human decision makers who can be identified and challenged, but by automated systems that present their aesthetic judgments as objective measures of engagement and relevance. The specific psychological violence of this digital aesthetic enforcement is its scale and intimacy. It operates not in the public sphere of advertising billboards and magazine covers, but in the most intimate digital spaces of individual social media feeds, beauty tutorials, and personal recommendation systems, reaching into the specific private moments of self-perception and self-evaluation where the colorist architecture does its deepest psychological work. Track 2, the Manichaean Logic Automated. The French-Algerian philosopher and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon identified what he called the Manichaean logic of colonialism. The binary division of the colonial world into the zone of the colonizer, light, civilized, fully human, and the zone of the colonized, dark, primitive, less than fully human, as the foundational epistemological structure of colonial domination. Modern neocolonialism has automated this Manichaean logic. The specific binary of light, dark, civilized, primitive, desirable, undesirable has been encoded into the training data of algorithmic systems across every domain of digital life, from the facial recognition systems that misidentify darker-skinned faces at dramatically higher rates, to the hiring algorithms that systematically downrank candidates whose digital profiles contain signals associated with blackness, to the content moderation systems that apply different standards to content from different communities. The automation of the Manichaean logic is its most dangerous upgrade. It removes the specific human decision makers whose biases could be identified, challenged, and potentially changed, and replaces them with automated systems whose biases are encoded in mathematical language that is simultaneously more authoritative and more inaccessible to challenge than any human judgment. The epistemological rebellion, the three-part counter-strategy. The counter-strategy to the cold strategic architecture of colorism is not merely political, not merely economic, and not merely cultural. It is, at its foundation, epistemological, a rebellion of consciousness, a systematic refusal of the manufactured conditions that the colorist architecture has installed, conducted through the specific cognitive and spiritual disciplines that the Sanskrit tradition identifies as viveka, vairagya, and abhyasa. Viveka, recognizing the installation. The first act of epistemological rebellion is viveka, the discriminative awareness that recognizes colorism not as a natural preference, not as a cultural tradition, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a deliberately installed colonial technology, a specific, strategic, historically documented system of social engineering that was designed to serve the interests of colonial power and that continues to serve those interests in its digitized, algorithmicized contemporary form. This recognition is not merely intellectual, it is liberatory, the specific cognitive act through which the community moves from being the passive subject of the colorist architecture's operation to being the active, conscious, critical analyst of that operation. You cannot dismantle a system you cannot see. Viveka makes the system visible. In practical terms, Viveka applied to colorism means the capacity to recognize the specific moments in which the colorist hierarchy is operating, in hiring decisions, in media representation, in the beauty industry's product recommendations, in the internal social dynamics of community organizations, in the specific ways that darker-skinned members of the community are treated differently from lighter-skinned members, and to name those moments accurately, not as natural preference, but as the cold strategic architecture performing its designed function. Vairagya, releasing the buffer class privileges. The second act of epistemological rebellion is vairagya. the radical non-attachment that releases the specific privileges that the buffer class position provides, recognizing that those privileges are not genuine freedom but a more comfortable form of captivity, the specific captivity of people who have been given a marginal advantage within an unjust hierarchy in exchange for their participation in the maintenance of that hierarchy. This is the most personally demanding dimension of the epistemological rebellion, because it requires people who have benefited from the colorist hierarchy, however marginally, however ambivalently, to release those benefits in service of the collective liberation that the hierarchy was specifically designed to prevent. It requires the recognition that the lighter-skinned person's advantage within the colorist system is not a personal achievement, but a structural assignment, one that comes at the specific cost of the darker-skinned person's disadvantage, and that therefore cannot be genuinely celebrated without celebrating the system that produced it. Vairagya applied to colorism means the willingness to actively challenge the hierarchy rather than benefit from it, to use whatever proximity to power the buffer class position provides, not to advance within the existing hierarchy, but to dismantle the hierarchy from within in the tradition of John Brown's radical decentering of privilege in service of the liberation project. Abhyasa, the long practice of mutual accountability. The third act of epistemological rebellion is abhyasa, the sustained, consistent, long-term practice of mutual accountability and solidarity that the dismantling of the colorist architecture requires. This is not a single dramatic act of consciousness. It is a daily practice, the specific, unglamorous, essential work of consistently choosing solidarity over hierarchy, consistently challenging the colorist assumptions that the system has installed, consistently holding the community accountable to the values of mutual recognition and collective dignity that the colorist architecture was specifically designed to prevent. Abhyasa applied to colorism means the long-term commitment to building the specific cultural, educational, and institutional infrastructure that makes the epistemological rebellion sustainable across generations, the schools that teach the history of colorism as colonial technology, the media platforms that represent the full spectrum of Black beauty without hierarchy, the community organizations that actively challenge colorist assumptions in their internal operations, and the families that consciously and deliberately refuse to transmit the colorist preferences that the system has tried to install as cultural tradition. The relay of resistance, how the four archetypes address colorism. The four archetypes of resistance, Tubman, King, Brown, and Malcolm X, represent the specific complementary dimensions of the relay of resistance that the epistemological rebellion against colorism requires. Tubman and Brown provide the ground-level foundation, the what of resistance, the immediate, physical, practical refusal of the conditions that the colorist architecture imposes, the direct action that liberates people from the specific material consequences of the hierarchy, and the radical decentering of privilege that challenges the buffer class dynamic from within. King provides the civic structure, the how of resistance, the sustained, disciplined, strategic engagement with the political and legal systems that maintain the colorist hierarchy, the specific legislative and judicial campaigns that challenge colorist discrimination in employment, housing, education, and media representation, and the long-term organizational infrastructure that makes the resistance sustainable across cycles of progress and regression. Malcolm X provides the epistemological content, the why of resistance, the systematic restoration of sovereign consciousness that allows the community to recognize the colorist hierarchy as a colonial installation rather than a natural preference. The specific intellectual and cultural work of filling the emptied psyche with the truth about the history and function of colorism and the pedagogical sophistication to transmit that truth across generations. The wicked idealism of colorism, the specific insidious way in which the colorist hierarchy presents itself as natural preference, cultural tradition, and even community value, functions as the primary interference pattern in this relay. The specific mechanism through which the system disrupts the transmission of liberatory consciousness from one generation to the next, ensuring that each generation must rediscover the truth about colorism rather than inheriting it as established community knowledge. Understanding this interference pattern is the specific contribution that the epistemological rebellion makes to the relay. By naming the colorist architecture as a colonial installation, by documenting its history and its mechanisms, and by building the educational and cultural infrastructure through which that knowledge can be transmitted reliably across generations, the epistemological rebellion repairs the relay, making possible the comprehensive, multi-dimensional liberation project that all four archetypes were working toward. End of Part 2. Continues in Part 3.